built this glass house, and once you go in there with a rock and start throwing rocks at the walls, their whole world starts to crumble because it's built on glass. It's built on a
Yeah.
sandy foundation. And so it's really important to kind of have the robust have a robust enough system of theology and belief that it can sustain itself in the face of real criticism, real objective attack, because it happens. And
I 100% agree with Travis that it's really important to have a strong enough system of theology to really weather attacks from critics. The question I have, though, is can the LDS faith withstand real objective criticism? I would encourage Travis to be very, very honest, brutally honest if necessary, with himself on that question.
so that's one of the reasons why I'm a Latter-day Saint, is because we do believe, whether the belief is true or not. And what I mean by that is whether or not the president of our church is actually an apostle equivalent to a Peter or a Paul or a James, and whether or not the quorum of the 12 are equivalent to the quorum of the 12 that are called by Christ, whether they have the same mantle, power, authority, and revelatory ability, I'm still making that claim. And that claim makes sense because whether they're doing it or not, at least I would expect that to be consistent with God's pattern as it's been revealed in the biblical text and actually culminated in the revelation of the biblical text.
It seems here Travis is basing his worldview of a continued revelation on the pattern of Scripture itself, which, as someone who holds the idea that Scripture is our highest spiritual authority, I applaud his appeal to Scripture. However, there is nothing in Scripture that promises continued revelation as always a guarantee. There were periods in the biblical text that were not as active revelation-wise as other periods. For instance, take 1 Samuel 3:1 that states that the word of the Lord was rare in the days of Eli the priest, and that there was no widespread revelation. There doesn't seem too much in the way of prophets in the biblical text between the time of Noah and Abraham. Then we also have Amos 8:11, a verse that Latter-day Saints know well, that proclaims a famine of hearing the words of the Lord. Let me be clear. I am not arguing that these texts are supportive of a closed canon. What I am arguing, though, from these texts is that how much or how little of ongoing revelation there is completely up to God. If God decided to stop giving revelation because he saw the biblical text as sufficient enough for humans to have a vibrant relationship with him, that would certainly be God's prerogative to do. That may not make a lot of sense to Travis for God to do that, but since God is a much higher being than us, it's logical to conclude that there will be times that God's ways will not make total sense to us.
I don't believe that God would just simply reveal documents and then close off the period of special revelation and then basically rely on academics and scholars, because repeatedly we're told not to put our trust in the arm of flesh. Now, the contrary argument, which I understand well, is, well, they're just guys and you're just trusting men. Well, Moses was just a guy and they were just trusting men. Abraham was just a guy and they were just trusting men. The fact that Abraham and Moses and them spoke to God was a matter of faith and belief by those who followed them. And even all of the prophets throughout the Hebrew Bible, it's not like all of them did what Elijah did and called down pillars of fire from heaven to validate their prophetic mission. Some of them just preached, and the people had to listen. And so they would have negative consequences of the fact of not listening to the preaching. But of course, those could be just attributed to, right? You could just say, well, Babylon overcame us because we didn't prepare for war properly, or our king sucked. Like, you can just blame it on something else, right? So, like, well, it's not because we killed the prophets. It's because, our king's not very good at ruling the world. So, so we fell into this negative situation. So, but yeah, I really kind of that's kind of how I ground my acceptance of the Book of Mormon, if that makes sense.
Again, I applaud Travis here for making a scriptural reference that we should not trust in the arm of the flesh. I am sure Travis would agree here that this does not mean we should abandon the use of our brains when dealing with the biblical texts. When it comes to understanding the biblical text, there is, of course, a wide range of difficulty levels. Some texts are very easy to understand, such as John 11:35. I don't think there's anything about Jesus wept that would require an in depth scholarly analysis to understand what's going on. But then there are other texts, say like Genesis 1, that biblical scholars can't come to any kind of interpretive agreement on. So, what is a guy to do? I would argue that one should do what I would suggest anyone to do when coming to a position on anything, and that would be to follow the weight of argumentation and evidence. For instance, take the position of the days of Genesis 1. Are they literal 24-hour days, or are they meant to be understood in a non literal way? I believe we should approach that question by looking at both interpretations and evaluate the evidence and reasons given for the two different interpretations, and then come to a conclusion based on which side has the strongest argumentation and the greatest evidence behind it. I don't believe in this idea that those of us who hold the Sola Scriptura are hopelessly doomed to a bunch of competing interpretations that we can't make heads or tails out of. That is often how it's framed, but I don't think that is the case.
Yeah, yeah, that kind of does. Now, what would happen? What would happen if, like, the leaders of the LDS Church were to go, like, say something like really, really wild? I'm trying to think of something that would be like totally contrary to the biblical text. Like, I don't know, let's just do a day of rage, and I don't know, like,
Let's just go out and yeah,
yeah,
whatever.
something.
Let's do a purge. Let's do a purge. Yeah.
Yeah, basically like Viking, like medieval Vikings would do.
Yeah.
Like what would how would a faithful LDS saint navigate that?
Um, well, we see evidence of that happening in the biblical texts.
Yeah,
The prophets come in. I always think that's a funny question because I don't think the Israelites did anything that would be, you know, shocking. But they believe God told them to do it, right? Go kill the Amalekites. Go kill, right? Go murder and slay, go destroy, go, take their wives, destroy their men, burn their fields, destroy their I mean, they were asked to do some of the I think that would be the most horrible thing is to engage in some kind of a genocide, to wipe out an entire civilization or people, right? As a consequence of what? They were mean to us a long time ago.
I never got a satisfying answer of how a Latter day Saint would navigate the issue of an immoral command being given by the LDS Church. The best I got later on in the conversation was that the LDS Church has something like a checks and balance system. And the question I have is, what if the checks and balances are all in agreement that something like the purge was to happen? Based on Travis bringing up the Canaanites, it seems like Travis knows he would have to comply with such a command if ever given. Someone that holds Sola Scriptura, however, could disregard the command and say that such a command violates the commands given in the New Covenant. Now, to be fair to Travis, someone can hold the Sola Scriptura and twist Scripture to say whatever they want and justify any sort of immoral action through twisting the Scriptures. I do think, though, the strength of Sola Scriptura, though, is that one is not bound by another person's divine revelation to commit immoral acts. Just like any person can twist Scripture, any person can claim that God has revealed things to them. Personally, I like the option of being able to check and validate things than rather than being forced to accept the premise that the leader of my institution is actually receiving divine revelation.